Good afternoon. I would like to thank the GW Law community for joining us. My name is Alexa Kiernan, and I am Associate Director of GW Law Alumni Relations. During this COVID-19 pandemic, GW Law continues to provide the community with an opportunity to hear the reflections from our faculty on the effects of the pandemic on their particular legal fields of research and practice, as well as how their classroom was impacted. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Jessica Steinberg. She is Associate Professor of Clinical Law and a nationally recognized expert on civil access to justice. She has written about case outcomes for low-income pro se litigants, corporate capture of small claims courts, innovations in the delivery of legal services, and the evolving role of the judge in civil matters. Professor Steinberg is the former chair of the AALS section on poverty law and the recipient of the California State Bar Public Interest Award. She has received her BA from Barnard College, magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, and her JD from Stanford Law School. Professor Steinberg's research is largely empirical in nature. She is currently conducting a multi-investigation of the civil justice landscape to contribute to our understanding of how courts and judges manage the flood of pro se cases. Her scholarship has been published or is forthcoming in many legal journals and the peer-reviewed social science journal, Law and Social Inquiry. She is regularly asked to present her research by groups such as the ABA, Pew Charitable Trusts, and the Self-Represented Litigant Network. In her teaching capacity, Professor Steinberg founded and directs the Prisoner and Reentry Clinic. Students represent prisoners and returning citizens experiencing the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. Professor Steinberg and her students handle cases involving applications for parole, clemency, and criminal record sealing, among others, exposing the students to core lawyering skills and encouraging them to develop sophisticated views on mass incarceration. Professor Steinberg authored the first ever parole practice manual to support pro se prisoners handling their own parole cases, as well as pro bono lawyers working in this sphere. Professor Steinberg is deeply involved in community-based advocacy and policy reform. She co-authored the District of Columbia's Ban the Box bill, which restricts employers from using criminal records information in the initial phases of the hiring process. She developed a white paper on reform of the district's good time and compassionate release programs. She also regularly testifies at the DC Council and at local and federal agencies. When opportunities arise, Professor Steinberg also trains law students to testify at public hearings. Professor Steinberg is passionate about advising students on public interest careers, devoting significant time to helping them obtain prestigious postgraduate public interest fellowships. Professor Steinberg, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you as our guest speaker in this COVID-19 legal briefing webinar series with GW Law faculty.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's get started with the first question. Can you tell us generally about your work with the Prisoner and Reentry Clinic?
Yes, absolutely. You did such a good job describing it, and I'll share some additional details. I founded the Prisoner and Reentry Clinic in 2011 with the goal of providing legal representation to prisoners and to people facing legal barriers as a result of their criminal records. So I identified this as a gap in the legal services delivery field. Law students enroll in the clinic for academic credit, and then they represent clients under my supervision. And we work on a range of matters. We work on petitioning the courts and administrative agencies to release our clients from prison. when those remedies exist. We work with a lot of clients who are on community supervision, so whether it's parole or supervised release, and we try to help them end their term of supervision early. We work on expungements of criminal records so that our clients have easier access to jobs and to housing. And as Alexa noted, we work on a lot of local criminal justice policy. I do a lot of work with the DC Council, and I prepare my students when the opportunity arises organically to testify in support of pending bills. Often, we are simply presenting the stories of our clients and sharing how a new law, a new bill, might bring justice to an individual and to people like him. So we're putting a face on why reform is needed. And I'll say that one of my goals in directing this clinic is to try to keep it as flexible and as nimble as possible so that I can respond to new issues on the ground as they emerge. I really want my students to connect current events in their community to the work that they're doing in the clinic. And so as an example, when the Obama administration launched a clemency project to release low-level drug offenders sentenced to very long prison terms, I suspended the regular work of my clinic and devoted a full year to working on clemency cases. And this was very energizing for the students. When the district passed a new law allowing expungements of prostitution convictions for victims of sex trafficking, which happened just last year, we took on one of the first clients to petition for relief under that law to make sure that it was getting enforcement in the field. So these are the types of activities that my students and my clinic are involved in. And in the seminar portion, because it is a classroom course, we reflect on what the students are learning and seeing in the field. We discuss race and poverty, we discuss mass incarceration, and we discuss alternatives. I really consider the clients the teachers, and I see it as my role to process with the students what they are learning in real time about the criminal justice system through their clinic work.
What have been the effects of the pandemic on the criminal justice system?
I think it's safe to say that the impact of COVID has been tremendous in many spheres, and the criminal justice system is certainly one of them. First, of course, is the issue of spread within our jails and our prisons. Prisons are congregate living facilities where there is no opportunity to socially distance. Prisoners don't have access to hand sanitizer, sometimes because regulations restrict their access since hand sanitizer has alcohol content. They don't have access to tests or to adequate testing in the prisons. The facilities aren't disinfected, at least not on a regular basis. And there are staff shortages. So just as one local example, the DC jail administered a little over 300 COVID tests between March and May, and 185 came back positive, a huge number. So the virus is spreading like wildfire in our jails. And we have to keep in mind, that this is a humanitarian crisis in our prisons, but also that this affects not just disease transmission among prisoners, but also among staff and the communities they live in. So that's one impact. Another is that our criminal courts are very limited in their operations right now. Many courts are closed or they're partially closed. They're taking only emergency matters. Criminal trials are taking longer than usual to schedule. And what that means is that we have many, many people being held in jails across the country for a longer period of time than usual. And they have not been convicted of a crime yet, and they may never be. They're in jail and they're at risk of contracting COVID simply because they're too poor to afford bail. So those are the challenges. I will say there has been a groundswell of advocacy nationwide to address this issue, these many issues, and to release as many incarcerated people as possible. And there are ways to do this with very little risk to the public. And I can name some of the few efforts that I've come across. We can release people with less than a year left on their sentence, right? People who are very close to being released anyway. We can release people convicted of petty offenses, nonviolent offenses, first-time offenses. We can release people being held in jail pre-trial, the folks I mentioned, even if they can't afford bail. People who are sentenced to halfway houses, we can give them home confinement instead. We can advance parole hearing dates, right? So give people an opportunity to go up a little bit earlier for parole. And we can release people older than 50 or 60 or those with underlying health conditions. And I do want to say that efforts like this are underway across the country. Some cities and states have been especially proactive in reducing their jail population. Frankly, not enough is being done to address prison populations. So the people convicted of felony offenses who are incarcerated in prison. I think a distinction is being made in policy efforts between the release of nonviolent offenders on the one hand and the release of violent offenders on the other hand. And I think that distinction does not often hold up under closer scrutiny. So in my clinic, we regularly represent clients who are 60 years old, 65 years old. They're suffering from Hep C, or they've had double hip replacements recently, or they walk with a cane, or can't easily dress themselves. Did they commit violent offenses? Yes, but often 30 years ago. Is public safety compromised by their release, especially if they have a home and a family to return to? I think we need to be looking harder at that question.
How has the Prisoner and Reentry Clinic remained active during the pandemic? And what have been the major efforts?
Thank you so much for that question, Alexa. My clinic has been especially focused during this time on reducing the prison population. And in particular, toward working on the release of older and health-compromised DC prisoners. And so toward that end, I wrote 2 pieces of legislation in collaboration with the Public Defender Service and with the Council for Court Excellence, both local organizations in DC. And both laws ended up being adopted by the DC Council in its emergency COVID bill. So I can take you through each. The first law creates a compassionate release program in DC. It's really our first meaningful compassionate release program locally. And so what this means is that we now have a law and guidance allowing prisoners to petition the court for early release from prison if they are terminally ill, if they are medically vulnerable to COVID, or if they are over 60 years old and have served 25 years in prison. So that's one law, a new compassionate release program. The second piece of legislation retroactively grants good time credits to older prisoners who had previously been barred from receiving these credits. And so good time credits are a common correctional tool. They exist almost everywhere in one form or another, and they are typically awarded to prisoners for both complying with institutional rules, avoiding disciplinary infractions, and also for participating in prison programming. So it's like a carrot and a stick approach. And then the credits are used, they accumulate over time, and they are used to deduct time off the end of a prisoner's sentence. But around 1,000 DC prisoners, we identified 1,000 DC prisoners who had never received good time credits because of harsh laws put into place in the 1990s during the war on crime. And so this new law retroactively grants these older prisoners good time credits. These are people who have been in prison more than 20 years. And it helps them to gain access to a parole hearing earlier than they otherwise would have, so they can make their case for release.
How are these new laws being implemented on the ground?
Well, I'd love to share one story, which really was a highlight of my summer. And that is that one of our clients was released under the new compassionate release law only days after the law went into effect. And it's something I worked on with students and that my colleague Maya Diamond worked on with our students. And it felt really great to be able to demonstrate for the law students this connection between policy development and policy advocacy and then enforcement on the ground and how it impacts real people and real individuals. Our client was 69 years old. He'd been in prison for 38 years for robberies that occurred in 1982, robberies where nobody was hurt. And he was suffering from a number of health conditions, chronic bronchitis, hypertension, diabetes. My law students and my colleague, Maya Diamond, had worked for months trying to get him released. This was before compassionate release was enacted. They filed a 200-page petition with the U.S. Parole Commission detailing the urgency of releasing our client due to COVID. And the petition, after months of work in preparing this case, the petition was rejected within hours from the Parole Commission, giving us the sense that it didn't even get careful consideration. So I say all this to emphasize that under the pre-existing regime, under the pre-existing set of laws in the district, our client was literally slated to die in prison until compassionate release became an option. And once it did, we were able to immediately pivot and petition a judge in DC Superior Court for his release. And we were able to point to his age and to his health as reasons to allow him to return home to his family. And sort of an astonishing aspect of this case, I thought, and I'm talking to lawyers, so I think you'll all appreciate this, an astonishing aspect was the speed within which this case was resolved. We filed a motion for compassionate release with the court, and within 4 days, we had a ruling in our client's favor. And the very next day after that, he walked out of prison a free man. And I share this story because I think it provides some hope about our criminal justice system. The courts, the Bureau of Prisons, these are cumbersome institutions that usually work very slowly. They often don't deliver justice as often as we'd like. But in this instance, these institutions worked with remarkable speed to release our client. I've worked with dozens and dozens of incarcerated clients, and I've never seen anything like this. So one thing I think I want to take away from this, and I think we have to ask ourselves and of our justice system, is if we can do this during COVID, can we continue to do it during normal times? Can we continue to show compassion and mercy? Can we continue to take swift and decisive action to end mass incarceration where appropriate and release people who don't need to be in prison? And I want to share just as sort of another measure of hope, that something that has been very energizing to me during this time, which has otherwise had many bleak moments. That criminal justice advocates in DC have been absolutely extraordinary in the way that they've mobilized around the new compassionate release program to help old and sick prisoners get released. And so my clinic has partnered with a number of national organizations like FAM and NACDL. We've partnered with local organizations like the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and PDS. I know I'm forgetting a few, there have been so many, as well as local law firms like Aiken Gump, to launch a DC compassionate release clearinghouse and collective. And together, over the last number of weeks, we have churned out training manuals and webinars. We've developed resources and sample petitions, sample orders, all around compassionate release, so that as we reach out to clients within the prisons to tell them about this new remedy, we can also simultaneously actively recruit pro bono lawyers to take these emergency cases on behalf of clients.
I'm particularly interested to hear your response to the next question, Professor Steinberg. How does your work connect to the protests unfolding across the country around police violence?
Thank you for that question as well. I think it's a very important one. I will say that I work on the very back end of the criminal justice system, with clients who have been in the system and in prison for decades. And so you would think, well, that's very different than what's going on in the movement about police reform. But there is an important connection to be made. When we visit our clients in prison and talk to them, which we often do for hours and hours to hear their life stories, and then when we go back to the clinic offices at the law school and we dive into their records, thousands of pages, there's a pattern that emerges. Many of our clients first had contact with the police when they were as young as 8 or 9 years old. They've been in so many lineups for so many crimes they didn't commit that they often can't remember when they were actually arrested, when they were actually charged, and when they were let go and nothing happened. So they often can't even give us an accurate picture of their criminal record. We have to find it in a document. We've had clients convicted at age 14 for crimes like assault with a dangerous weapon. Sounds serious, right? But then when we unseal their juvenile records to get details, we see that the deadly weapon involved, it was the client's own foot. So kicking your cousin in the lunchroom at school, these are the actual facts of the case we worked on, that can get you convicted for assault with a deadly weapon. And that's because we've deployed police officers in our schools and poor neighborhoods. And often when you're involved in the criminal justice system at such a young age, you can't recover from it. You're suspended from school, you're expelled from school, you spend time in a juvenile detention facility. It's sort of a vicious cycle that leads to more contact with law enforcement, more arrests, and more convictions. And then decades later, I meet you in prison and a life has really been lost to the system. And so that's how I see this all connecting as a continuum. Our entire criminal justice system needs to be re-examined and really reimagined. And I think this is a time to do it.
Your research focuses on civil justice issues, especially those dealing with basic human needs such as shelter and safety. Can you discuss how the pandemic is affecting the civil courts?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is so important. A lot of focus right now is on the criminal justice system, and rightly so. But the civil justice system is in crisis as well, even under normal times. And I think it's important to talk about that for a moment before delving into COVID and its impact. So one of the major problems, and this is sort of largely hidden from public view, one of the major things going on in the civil courts is that there are virtually no lawyers there. Sounds like an exaggeration, but it's actually the case. So I'm talking numbers like 90% of people are evicted without a lawyer in this country. 90% of people face debt collection that can lead to wage garnishment and other collateral effects without a lawyer. 90% of people asking for a restraining order against domestic abuse do so without a lawyer. And judges are required to be impartial They can't give legal advice. That's part of our judicial ethics code. And that's the American ideal. And so we have millions of people who are coming before our courts, our civil courts, and they don't know how to assert their rights. And nobody can help them, at least not with the amount of help they really need. And so that's one problem. A second issue in the civil courts is that increasingly they are really playing a role in society that they are not equipped to play. And that role is to grapple day in and day out with the effects of extreme income inequality. Other branches of government, as we know, have not delivered affordable housing or affordable health care or quality public education or mental health services or substance abuse services. And so the civil courts have become really the government actor of last resort for millions of Americans who are facing eviction, who are in debt over medical bills, who are facing family violence. Our courts and our judges, and this is really so critical to understand, they have become our frontline observers to the breakdown of the social contract. They're the ones who see it every day, and they don't have the tools they need to address the fundamental need for safety and shelter and income insecurity. And so I say all this because when we talk about COVID, it's clear that the pandemic will only exacerbate these problems. Many civil courts are mostly closed right now. Some are completely shuttered. Many are hearing only emergency cases. Evictions are on hold. There are moratoria across the country. But that is about to end, and soon, probably by midsummer. And so what can we expect to see when courts reopen? I think they'll reopen to an absolute flood, an avalanche of new cases. There will be a flood of evictions. There will be a flood of debt collection cases. In fact, many of those cases are continuing to be filed. The courts are open for the filing of debt collection lawsuits, but not to the defense and not to the hearings. And so the courts will be totally overwhelmed by these pending cases when they reopen. And the economic fallout from COVID virtually guarantees this deluge. So I think it's important that we shine a light on these issues as well, since they also have such a disproportionate effect on Black and Brown Americans.
Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask how our students at GW Law are faring in the job market. Are there ways to help current students with career connections or job opportunities?
Yes, this has been a very tough summer and time for our students. Many of them were very excited about internships and job opportunities in issues where they were passionate, that they hoped would lead to jobs post-graduation, or they have graduated and they were expecting to transition into a particular role. And a lot of that is on hold and for understandable reasons. So we do have many law students looking for positions this summer, even part-time. We have graduating students who may not be able to take the bar exam until the fall or later, and so they're not studying yet, and they're also free. My colleague, Maya Diamond, who I work with, and I are supervising about 10 or 12 law students this summer. We typically don't work with law students. We do research over the summers, but they are so excited to get involved. This is purely volunteer, no money, no academic credit, no credit at all. But they're so engaged in the issues and wanting to contribute. So we appreciate, especially the Career Center, any leads for full or part-time jobs, virtual or not, research projects, or anything that can be done remotely, because our law students are so phenomenal and so dedicated.
If someone cannot help with job opportunities now, are there other ways the GW Law community can assist?
Yes, so I understand we now have a GW Cares Emergency Student Assistance Fund, which is fabulous. And that is meant to help students facing financial hardship during the COVID crisis. We also, and this is amazing, have a group of very generous donors who are matching all donations up to $100,000 this semester. And so any gift amount is greatly appreciated. It will be matched, and it will go a long way to assisting our current students.
Thank you for identifying the ways in which the GW Law community can help students. We asked for alumni to submit questions in advance of the webinar, and an alumna has asked the following question. Has the clinic been involved in any compassionate release or general release efforts in light of the pandemic's effects relating to crowd prisoning?
Yeah, so I spoke about a lot of that, a lot of our work around law development and taking cases. I have several students right now. I really didn't talk a lot about the good time law, but that's critical as well. As I mentioned, there are 1,000 prisoners right now in the system who have the opportunity to receive deductions off their sentence, right, and to petition for parole earlier. And I have had unbelievable student volunteers working with clients to recalculate their cases, and then to advocate with the U.S. Parole Commission to advance parole eligibility dates. So that's another thing we're working to implement, to make sure that this isn't a law that just remains on the books, but is implemented on the ground in practice and benefits real clients. And I have to say that the Bureau of Prisons has been an outstanding partner in this. They're responding to our requests. They are working very, very hard to recalculate sentences. So we are doing that. We are thinking about prepping and taking additional compassionate release cases as the summer progresses. And so we are deeply, deeply involved and invested in that effort.
Thank you, Professor Steinberg, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I appreciate your willingness to answer these questions. I wish the best with your academic research. Also, I want to thank Mike Briggs from the GW Law IT department as he continues to help us with these monthly webinars. Lastly, I want to thank our GW Law community for joining us this afternoon. You will receive a follow-up email after this webinar, and we appreciate your willingness to help our students. GW Law continues to wish for you and your families to stay safe and well during this uncertain time. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon.